Hello and welcome to another edition of Newsroom 2.0 on CAN TV. I am your host, Vaughn Bryant, bringing you relevant topics and the news from the week. We'll be right back with our first guest. Our first guest is Andrea Zop. Andrea has held executive positions at several Fortune 500 companies, served as deputy mayor in the Emanuel administration, served as CEO of World Business Chicago, and is currently a managing partner at Cleveland Avenue. She is joining CAN TV as our chief political analyst. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Vaughn.
Yeah. Let's jump right in. So last week, Governor Pritzker signed legislation that enacts an extensive ban on firearms as well as high-capacity magazines. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it was a great time finally that we have one. It's been a little too long, in my view. We'll have to see, how much of it will remain after it's going to be challenged, and how much of it will remain. But I think it's absolutely a step in the right direction. So
I want to go to the Safety Act next, but do you think it's going to have the same challenges that the Safety Act has gotten?
Well, I think it'll be different. It's a whole different group of people who are challenging. Okay. I mean, similar groups of people, but different. The gun lobbyists. And the laws are already existing on the Second Amendment, so a lot will just depend on where it lands. Mm-hmm. And if we've moved any, because of the incredible number of killings that we've had, mm-hmm. particularly with high-capacity weapons, and there's no question that public action and activity influences the courts. So we'll see.
I hear you. And then with the Safety Act, it remains in limbo. Do you think it has a chance to pass?
Well, the Safety Act itself is enacted in large parts, except for the pretrial provision on cash bail. Okay. So the rest of it is enacted and happening, and there's there are a number of law enforcement people and prosecutors who are unhappy with it. I think largely they are changes that needed to be made. I think people who are don't really appreciate some of the challenges that people of color, people who are marginalized have in the criminal justice system. The cash division, the no cash bail provision, I think will remain. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's, I don't think it's an issue. Again, people don't really understand. The law allows you to detain people who are dangerous or a flight risk. Mm-hmm. And it requires judges to make that decision. The law today, they're supposed to make that decision. They often do not, mm-hmm. because it's so much easier just to impose a cash bail. And what ends up happening is we end up having people in custody mm-hmm. who are there not because they're a danger or because they're a flight risk, but because they're poor mm-hmm. or they don't have the money. And we also have a challenge around, we have to understand what is dangerous. But this, under the no cash bail provision, judges will actually have to make a finding. And requiring judges to look at it and make a finding matters. And right. So I think in the long run, it's going to be good and fine, and I think it's going to be upheld by the Supreme Court. And
as a prosecutor, did you face this type of thing on a regular basis?
Well, when I was a prosecutor, we had cash, cash bails. But what we did do, for example, when I was a prosecutor, we created a whole separate court called Night Drug Court mm-hmm. to deal with people charged with low-level drug offenses mm-hmm. with the whole intent and purpose of making sure that they didn't get into custody, that they were put into processes and systems where they could get treatment because they weren't criminals. Mm-hmm. They were people with an addiction problem. And so I do think it is important for the system to look at why people should be in custody. Mm-hmm. Who we need to be in custody are people who are dangerous or who we think are not going to come back. Mm-hmm. That's what bail is for, and everybody else should be out and required to come back to court when their date is up.
Yeah, that's good information. So the recent email snafu with the Lightfoot campaign, do you think that's going to be a big issue or just a blip on the screen?
I think it was bad, mm-hmm. But I think one thing to keep in mind is when you manage, and you know this, you manage people. When mm-hmm. you manage a number of people, people are going to make mistakes. They do. The question is, how do you respond when they make the mistake? Mm-hmm. She stepped up very quickly and said, that was a big mistake, mm-hmm. And addressed it pretty immediately. And so I don't think it should be a big issue. It was wrong. They understood it to be wrong. You saw what they were trying to do. I don't think they were trying to influence high school students to vote for the Lightfoot campaign. I think they were recruiting interns. They recruited in the wrong place, and so it was a mistake. And she said that very quickly.
Yeah, no, I hear you. So, who would you say are the most formidable challengers to Lightfoot?
Well, clearly Congressman Garcia, in large part because of his significant name recognition, is, I think, probably lead challenger. But there are others in the race who I think you're seeing more of. Brandon Johnson, who has a lot of money from the Chicago Teachers Union, and money matters in political races because it does what it's doing for him, which is enabling him to get on TV and elevate his presence and his name, and that matters when people will see him. And he's smart, he's articulate, he's a sitting county commissioner, so he has some understanding of government, although being a county commissioner is very different from being mayor of the city of Chicago. And so he's presenting well, and I think people will see him, and so that helps. Paul Vallis has gotten out a lot, although I think people are seeing him run a lot, so we'll see whether that matters. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the other candidates just haven't gotten up to get the name recognition that they'll need to run really effectively.
And are there any plans that any of the candidates have put out that, have particularly caught your eye?
Not really. I mean, I think, it is, I think clearly, crime and public safety matter, and I think it's important that everybody has a plan. I think sometimes people are unrealistic about, how they're going to change. People are like, well, we're going to recruit a bunch of more police officers. Well, if it was easy, and so you're going to have to do some things before you start recruiting, because right now people don't want to be police officers. So you can recruit all you want. If they don't come, it's not really going to matter. So, but I think the important point is, I think we're focusing on some of the right issues. I think I'm a little disappointed that people haven't been focused on education, because I think education and the Chicago public schools are going to be very important, and the fact that how those schools are going to be governed is also very important, yet you hear no one talking about it, and I think that's unfortunate. But I think mostly the issues of crime and finances of the city and making sure that the city is going to continue to come back after the pandemic are the right topics for people to be focusing on.
All right. Well, thank you for providing your insight and perspective.
Happy to do it.
Yeah,
Thanks for having me.
Hopefully, we'll see you again soon, I'm sure.
I think I'll be back.
All right. Well, we'll be right back with our roundtable discussion.
Change Agents places a spotlight on critical issues impacting Chicago's communities, including homelessness, gender-based violence, food inequity, bail reform, hate crimes, police reform, school bullying, the list goes on. Each week, we'll introduce you to the community organizations and leaders who are working on the front lines to address and combat these issues. Join me for Change Agents, Thursdays at 7 p.m. on CAN-TV 19 and streaming live on cantv.org.
In Chicago, we're sadly all too familiar with shootings and homicides. But do you ever wonder what happens with families and their community in the aftermath? Today, we have representatives from two community-based organizations that not only work to reduce gun violence, but also provide victim advocacy and support to families and communities impacted by gun violence. Joining us is Yolanda Fields, Executive Director at Breakthrough Urban Ministries, Jesse Huerta, Violence Intervention Manager at Enlace Chicago, and Steve Hendershot, a journalist with Crain, Chicago, who has written extensively on this topic. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So, Yolanda, can you sort of just give us a basic understanding of what Breakthrough Urban Ministries does?
Sure. Breakthrough is a comprehensive community development organization that works in 5 areas. Really, our goal is to see men, women, and families connected to resources, building connections, and reaching a thriving place. So we do our work in 5 areas: violence prevention, health and wellness, youth and education development, and then community economic development.
Got you. Jesse, how about you tell us about Enlace?
Well, Enlace, similar to Yolanda, right? We do violence prevention, but we also sit on 3 other pillars, which focuses on immigration, community health, right, and education, right? My focus there at the agency is violence prevention and intervention, right? Overseeing the victim advocacy team, the case management team, and the street outreach team.
Mm-hmm. So, Steve, if you could summarize for us the shooting that took place at Juarez High School a month or so ago.
Yeah, the most recent flashpoint, not unfortunately the most recent violence, but the most recent act of violence sort of reached that level of public awareness was just before the holidays at Juarez High School in Pilsen. It was right at the school let out, I think 6 or 8 shots. 2 students died, 2 more were wounded in one of those. I think the perpetrator was not, it wasn't a school community, it was outside the school community, but obviously students were affected, and that gets everybody's attention.
So when a shooting like that happens, like how does the community mobilize, Jesse, or how should it?
Now, it's a difficult question to answer, right? Because we'll start going into capacity. Mm-hmm. How much capacity does Enlace have, an agency like Breakthrough have, to support an organization or an agency outside of our boundaries? Mm-hmm. Juarez High School is outside of our boundaries. However, right, the connections that we have with Pilsen and Little Village allowed us to support and bring in staff to support not only the students but staff in the aftermath, mm-hmm. right? So just responding that way as support and being there for our community, it's what's going to help mm-hmm.
And
eventually.
can you say, sort of, in an ideal state, like what kind of resources would Juarez have at its disposal to best address a shooting that happens? So
the aftermath, trauma, mm-hmm. right? It was mentioned that it was after school. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of kids in the courtyard when this happened, right? 4 students, their age, involved in this, right? Mm-hmm. And 1 homicide, a student from the school. Of course you need some trauma-informed care, right? Mm-hmm. Clinicians to come in, support, right? So that support alone from outside organizations to support the students and the staff that were around as well, mm-hmm. right? It allows to not heal, right? You're not going to heal, but at least to process mm-hmm. some of what just happened. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and really start the healing process, because healing is a process that takes mm-hmm. a while. Yolanda, tell us about the shooting. I think it was 14 people in East Garfield Park. Can you sort of summarize what happened there?
Yeah, I think when we think about 14 individuals being impacted by violence is a big deal in any community. And for us, this particular tragedy involved maybe 3 different families, but 10 of the victims were from one family. Mm-hmm. And so I think that in itself speaks mm-hmm. to how horrific and impacting it would be on families and communities. And there were children involved. And so we're talking about multiple victims coming from just a few families, with the youngest victim being 3 years old. Wow. And it happened in a space where people were already mourning the loss of life. Mm-hmm. And so mm-hmm. I think that compounded the trauma that people that, were there were actually experiencing. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when the incident took place, can you walk us through, if you're able, like when you got the call and how you sort of mobilized the resources?
Yeah, I was, first of all, it was Halloween. So, mm-hmm. And that typically is a family-oriented, day. There were some things we had already planned in the neighborhood, and this happened shortly after those things. And so when we got the call, really the first thought was Thanksgiving, that at that point nobody had actually been killed. But we knew with that level of violence that we would need to really call in all of our partners. And so it was, how do we access all of the resources that are available to us in the collaboration that we're a part of? And so all of those outreach workers showed up, and they're really there trying to understand what, the problem is, what caused the violence, how might we reduce retaliation, but more than anything, how do we care for the victims? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I think there is the immediate response to the crisis, and then there is the response that happens over days, weeks, months, and even years. And so that more comprehensive response is still happening, right? The immediate response is to get in, to offer support to victims. And then after that, it's supplying wound kits. Something as simple, as that. It's understanding how we might connect with behavioral health services. It's one thing to have people really kind of stabilize during a crisis, but we understand that that trauma is going to need to be processed. And so connecting them with behavioral health, a behavioral health team that really could be with them over a period of time to address the concerns that we don't know anything about the day of an event like that.
And then what kind of supports do you provide for your staff that have to deal with such a tragic situation?
Yeah, it often, even when I am describing the work that we do, many of our staff are experiencing the same things that anybody else in our community is experiencing. And so for them, we want to be supportive, whether that's offering time off, if it's saying, hey, you might need to talk to someone. Let us connect you with the same kinds of resources that we would be providing some of those who have survived in our community.
Okay. Yeah. So Steve, you've written pretty extensively about community violence intervention. So what have you learned through sort of your journalistic lens?
This idea of trauma that we just brought up it's an interesting one, and what you just brought up is interesting. That idea of I think it's not limited to the violence space, that people do better at rising up to the moment of crisis than necessarily sticking around for the next months, years when it's all getting worked out. But I think that notion of if you live especially in one of these hot button communities, you've experienced something like this, and often they compound, the incidents compound, and it's hard to come at that, to get back to the sort of clean slate, ground zero place where you can work forward. And it just seems like then if we, as a city, policy, whatever, want to sort of, we have to address that.
So you've written extensively on this topic. What have you learned sort of about the community violence intervention space and the different organizations that are doing work?
Yeah, Chicago is not passive in this, right? We've been a leader for decades, and some of those initiatives have worked better than others, but it is interesting at this moment, and I realize I'm sitting around the table with some of the people that I'm describing right now, that there's a lot of interesting work based both on what can we do to de-escalate and intervene in the 90 minutes or 2 hours following something, but also what can we do to identify people both, especially at risk of becoming perpetrators of violence, to sort of unplug them from that cycle and put them on a different path, to help people with the trauma-based care. It's a unique mix of interventions that I really hope works here. But the cool thing is, if it does, enough of them are innovative that you could see that providing a model nationally, because unfortunately we're not the only community dealing with this stuff.
Yeah, that's right. So Jesse, tell me specifically what Enlace does on the prevention side to try to prevent gun violence.
So some of the areas that we work in is in the schools. It's one of the things that's very important, right, to do so in this prevention work, guide young people through that age, through the system of education, right, and maybe becoming prosper through this process. We also have programs, young programs focused on trauma-informed care. Cognitive behavioral therapy. One of the programs that we often promote is in art therapy, which is our Enlace program. Processing trauma through art, through poetry. And we're developing something around music and dance pretty soon. We have skateboarding programs for young ladies. We have girls program also that focus on the intervention side and the prevention side. With the young ladies, we often forget that young ladies are also suffering through this process. We focus a lot on the males, but the young ladies also need a lot of support.
And you tell us, because I know Enlace does a lot of support for their violence intervention workers. Can you talk more about how you got support your workforce?
Similar to Yolanda, right? We care for our employees just as much as we care for the young people or the adults in our community. Providing services just as we do to young people. We have a clinician specifically to work with the trauma that our staff endures during the process of their work. This person is open 24/7 as needed. When some of our staff members witness or part of some of the violence that has occurred in our community, because for the most part, our employees are from the community. All our workers are based in the community. They come from there, right? They are impacted just as much as any other stakeholder or residents in our community. So we have that support there for them.
Yeah. So Yolanda, getting back to you, like Breakthrough decided, 5 or 6 years ago to get into the violence intervention space. Like, tell us how you came to that and sort of what your experience has been since you've been involved.
Yeah, the one thing I love so much about East Garfield Park is that our community is very vocal. And so after completing the strategic plan, what we heard from the community is that safety was the #1 concern, and that they felt like if we were going to be true in partnership, then they wanted to see their safety issues addressed. And so when we were invited to the table, we recognized that there was work being done in this area and there were experts that we could learn from. And so I think it was a matter of bringing the expertise we had and helping people navigate obstacles and barriers to achieving goals through case management with this street level intervention that we firmly believed offered the right amount of intervention to actually make a difference in our community. And so we've been holistically on board since, because we recognize that nobody's coming to our community to save us. And so we have lived experts that can offer their skills and experience in a way that benefits our community.
So, and can you talk about sort of the growth of Breakthrough over time and sort of what you need to put in place in order to support that growth?
Yeah, I think we started, our founder had, one thing in mind, and it was really responding to the needs that men and women who were experiencing homelessness. And then as we listened to the community more and more, we found out that all of the work that we do really is a holistic approach to violence prevention and intervention. And I think, like most community violence intervention organizations, we need to be able to scale the work. And in order to scale it, you need staff who are well trained and who are well paid. You need an infrastructure, right? The back office stuff that is able to support it. And so I think if we're talking about what the city needs is what our organization needs. We need, public and private, all of those sectors to come together with a clear strategy and focus on what it means to reduce violence in Chicago.
Excellent. And then Jesse, one of the unique things about Little Village is the way that the community-based organizations work together, whether it's Enlace or New Life Centers or Beyond the Ball and others. Talk about you guys' ability to collaborate and sort of sacrifice for the greater good of the community.
So we are fortunate, Steve. We have the VPC, Violence Prevention Collaborative Network, of 22 to 25 organizations that come together, right? And that allows us to come and speak on some of the issues within the community and how to address it. These organizations you named, they target different areas of the violence prevention work, right? But when we come together holistically, we cover much more. We provide much more to the community than what Enlace alone can. So these other organizations that are supporting us, right, it's really great to come together and convene on addressing some of these issues.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, Steve, Yolanda, Jesse, thank you for joining me on Chicago Newsroom 2.0. Hopefully we'll have you back at some point. Thank you for joining us. We'll be right back. With the recent news of classified information being found at 2 separate locations associated with President Biden, and the news of emails from the Lightfoot campaign going to CPS and city colleges, it reminds us of why it's important for our leaders and representatives to avoid even the appearance of wrongdoing. Whether we are in a mild political time or our current state of polarization, politicians should not ask citizens for the benefit of the doubt as often as they do. We simply cannot afford unforced errors that add fuel to such a toxic political environment. Please take the necessary steps to dot all I's, cross all T's, and close all loops. It's the least you can do. I'll be right back here next week, amplifying community voices and analyzing the news that matters to Chicagoans. Until then, good night.